It was past midnight on August 31st, 1888, when Polly Nichols left a rooming house in the East End district of London known as Whitechapel. For her, walking these streets at this hour was part of doing business, as it was for many women in this bleak, impoverished part of the city. But this time, Polly's business would turn deadly. Somewhere in the darkness, she met a knife-wielding stranger with a ruthless motive. This stranger would kill repeatedly during the next 10 weeks, always suddenly, always silently. And with each victim grew a murderous legacy that spread suspicion, fear, and panic. And even now, arouses fascination. Over a century later, the crimes remain unsolved and the stranger's identity unknown, except by a name that's become synonymous with evil. The discovery of Polly Nichols' body at 3:40 a.m. in Bucks Row was in itself no cause for panic in the East End of London. Crime was an everyday fact of life here, and women were not uncommon victims.
Working class women were no strangers to violence. The East End was a rough place. Working class marriages were often abusive.
Yet this killing did not have the look of a domestic dispute gone wrong. What set it apart was its savagery. The murderer made 2 deep cuts along Polly Nichols' neck, nearly severing her head from her body. She'd also been badly mutilated, with jagged incisions leading from her groin up to her breastbone. Still, even with a corpse, an approximate time of death, and knowledge of the weapon, the police had little to work with. Their inquiries produced no motive, no eyewitnesses, and no suspects. Within days, the search for Polly Nichols' murderer reached a dead end. But today, many are still hot on the killer's trail. From around the world they come, drawn to hear the grisly tale of murder and mayhem.
And as far as this story is concerned, its own police force.
It's called the Ripper Walk, one of many attractions that, along with books, articles, films, and internet websites, support a multi-million-dollar industry born of a killer's brutality.
Violence was very much a part of these women's lives. And in the months preceding the Jack the Ripper murders, 2 prostitutes had already been brutally murdered.
In 1888, the idea of touring Whitechapel on foot would have struck most Victorians as sheer folly. A dismal, densely populated slum, it was home to the outcasts of society who eked out a meager living not far from the hallowed halls of government.
The East End was London's poor quarter, and it was also the area identified with poverty and social problems. Life was hard. Life had, if it had pleasures, they were very immediate, they were momentary.
The presence of such squalor in the celebrated capital of the British Empire deeply troubled Victorian author Thomas Henry Huxley.
I assure you I found nothing worse, nothing more degrading, nothing so hopeless, nothing nearly so intolerably dull and miserable as life in the East End of London.
You've got to sort of look at the East End as sort of a maze of houses, tiny streets, people living 7, 8, 9 in a room, overcrowded tenements, living above cesspits. The children, 55% of them are dead before the age of 5. The women, they can't get work, so they prostitute themselves.
East End prostitutes earned very little. It was a very shabby kind of prostitution, perhaps in a lodging house, often sexual encounters in the streets.
So notorious was the area, it was known as the evil Quarter Mile. Now that same Quarter Mile draws amateur sleuths and curiosity seekers who walk many of the same streets and see many of the same sights as the world's first widely known serial killer.
Most of the Ripper's victims were women in their 40s who, for one reason or another, had abandoned lovers, husbands, boyfriends, families, and taken a living on the streets. In appearance, their faces were puffy from drinking too much gin. They had cuts and bruises on their faces. They had teeth missing. You could buy an East End prostitute for 3 pennies, 2 pennies, or a loaf of stale bread.
9 days after Polly Nichols' murder on September the 8th, another brutal slaying occurred in Whitechapel. This time, the victim was a woman named Annie Chapman, an occasional prostitute who worked a local market area.
Behind me is the old Spitalfields fruit and vegetable market, built in 1887, 1 year before the murders. And until it closed down some years ago, it was still one of London's main fruit and vegetable markets.
So she went to the market on the 8th of September looking for a customer and was seen talking to a man who's described as a sort of foreign appearance, about in his 30s, wearing a deerstalker hat. They're seen talking outside number 29 Hanbury Street. The man is heard to ask, "Will you?" and Annie Chapman reply, "Yes."
It was a short time later that Chapman was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, having been murdered. A man called Albert Kadosh had come out of his house into the yard of the house next door and had heard a body or had heard something fall against the fence.
There's little doubt that she was killed by the same hand that killed Nichols. She'd had her throat cut, she was disemboweled.
While Chapman's death was more violent than Polly Nichols', the police were convinced the 2 killings were the work of the same person. Yet, given the evidence-gathering methods of the time, investigators were limited in their options.
Police can do very little except draft in extra reinforcements. It's hard to recognise now sort of how little in the way of scientific evidence the police would have been able to collect. You didn't have fingerprints, you didn't have blood groupings, you didn't have DNA.
Just 8 years before the murders, Scottish physician Henry Faulds published an article on the value of finger impressions as a means of criminal identification. Yet the use of what today is called fingerprinting and other now standard tools of detection was still a long way off.
It's going to be another 14 years before you get the first fingerprint conviction. Similarly, in 1888, the difference could not be told between animal and human blood. So you could have a situation where the murderer could be standing here and the victim could be lying there. The murderer could be covered in the victim's blood. He could have left his fingerprints and handprints all over the murder scene. With the state of scientific knowledge that existed in 1888, there was no way you could put the two together. The murderer has quite literally got to be caught in the act of murder.
As it was, they were stuck with applying the lessons that had been used for a long, long time, which were look for witnesses, act very quickly at the scene of murders, knock on doors. Get off your backside and knock on doors is an old adage of detectives that's been about for a long time. What they relied on mostly was eyewitness accounts, and as we know now, those can be very misleading.
Misleading indeed. While there were no eyewitnesses to the killings, there was no shortage of informants. Descriptions of suspicious individuals in the vicinity of the crimes often led the police in different directions.
I think he was wearing an overcoat, but I cannot be sure. He was a man over 40. As far as I could tell, he seemed a little taller than the deceased.
He had a hard billycock hat. He had a blotchy face and a carroty moustache.
He was a fine-looking man. He wore an overcoat with a cape, high hat, not a silk one, and a Gladstone bag.
Accounts of the Whitechapel murders spread like wildfire, fueled by newspapers only too eager to feed the public's voracious appetite for details.
Another murder of character even more diabolical than that perpetrated in Bucks Row. Her throat was cut in a fearful manner. The woman's body had been completely ripped open, and the heart and other organs laying about the place, and portions of the entrails around the victim's neck. An excited crowd gathered around.
The press were building it up. The murders were coming quickly on one another. There wasn't space of months in between where people would forget it and go on to something else. This was kept in the public eye continuously for a couple of months. And because of that, the police took very much a hammering, especially the detective force. They flooded the area with uniformed police officers in the hope, and really I think they realised that probably it's one of the only ways they were going to catch this guy, was to actually catch him leaving the scene of a murder or actually perpetrating a murder.
Police surgeon Dr. George Bagster Phillips examined Chapman's body some 2 hours after her death. His conclusions narrowed the field of potential suspects.
The injuries could have been done by such an instrument as a medical man used for post-mortem purposes. Those used by slaughtermen might have caused them. Knives in the leather trade would not be long enough in the blade. The mode in which these portions were extracted showed anatomical knowledge. Obviously, the work was that of an expert.
When Phillips' report was made public, it unleashed a frenzy of accusation. Immediately, suspicion fell upon those who used knives in their work, like doctors, butchers, and barbers.
A lot of people made out that he was a doctor, a surgeon. No, it's not the surgeon, it's a surgeon. He was a hack. And, you know, I think most people just hacking a body would find those sort of things anyway. They'd find the womb and things like that without any problem.
Later reports conflicted with Dr. Phillips' assertion. But by then, the court of public opinion, aided by the press, had turned to more convenient, non-English suspects.
What was also creating a stir was that the area, sort of in the 1880s, the area had got a large influx of immigrants, Jewish immigrants, many of them escaping from the pogroms in Tsarist Russia and in Eastern Europe. So the Jewish community was immediately being targeted as one of their number being actually responsible for the murders. It was said no Englishman would do such a terrible thing, and so the Jews were immediately the scapegoat for the murders.
One early suspect was a local Jewish shoemaker, known for harassing prostitutes, and by a distinctive nickname.
In the yard close to Annie Chapman's body had been found a leather apron, and immediately the word was circulated that one of the local people, a man called John Pizer, that was his nickname, Leather Apron. And so Pizer was arrested and for the Annie Chapman murder. But fortunately, he got an absolutely cast-iron alibi as to where he was at the time of the murder, so he was very, very lucky.
With the release of John Pizer, the investigation was back to square one. The Whitechapel murders fell under the jurisdiction of Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren. His Assistant Commissioner for Crime was Dr. Robert Anderson, who picked Chief Inspector Donald Swanson and Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline to head up the investigation.
Overall charge of the investigation was given to Chief Inspector Donald Swanson. Now, he is often described as the office man in charge at Scotland Yard, but he did in fact go out and do some inquiries himself, so he was very much part of the investigation as well as overseeing it.
Aberline was an ex-watchmaker, very meticulous man. He was into surveillance, and there's a fair bit of evidence that they disguised a lot of detectives out on the ground.
And also you had the vigilance committees on the street and private individuals who thought they were going to catch the murderer on the street.
The vigilance committees were made up of local residents frustrated by what they saw as the police's lack of progress. Among them, George Lusk headed Whitechapel's most prominent vigilance committee. He was a vocal critic of the investigation who would later play a more direct role in the case. Then, on September the 27th, a startling development. Now, 19 days after the second murder, a letter arrived at the Central News Agency.
Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about Leather Apron gave me real fits. I'm down on oars, and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal. How can they catch me now? I love my work and want to start again. You will soon hear of me with my funny little games. I saved some of the proper red stuff in a ginger beer bottle over the last job to write with, but it went thick like glue, and I can't use it. Red ink is fit enough, I hope. The next job I do, I shall clip the ladies' ears off and send to the police officers, just for jolly. Wouldn't you? Keep this letter till I do a bit more work, then give it out straight. My knife is so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away if I get a chance. Good luck. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper.
Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. Now there was a name for the Whitechapel murderer, but with a torrent of letters that bombarded the police weekly, no one could be sure if it was genuine. The newspapers printed the letter a few days later, popularizing the killer's nickname while sending waves of terror throughout the city. In addition to coverage laced with blood-curdling passages, London's tabloids also took aim at Commissioner Warren of the Metropolitan Police. Their editorials and cartoons demanded his resignation. Meanwhile, life for many in the East End grew more desperate.
In the area, you've got there's panic among the prostitutes.
For one Whitechapel prostitute, Elizabeth Stride, working the streets took its toll.
She's crying there. She's afraid. She's afraid of being killed by Jack the Ripper.
Liz Stride's fears were prophetic. On September 30th, 3 days after the Ripper letter appeared, she met her final customer, but this time there was a witness. His name was Israel Schwartz, at this point the only person who might positively identify the killer.
Schwartz said he saw a person struggling with quarters to 1 in the morning. Saw him struggling with the lady who he recognised, identified as Stride.
She was thrown to the ground. She cried out about 2 or 3 times. And Schwartz at that point had walked on, and he saw a man who was threatening, or he thought was threatening, and he ran away.
Stride's body was found a short time later, just off Berner Street. Her throat was cut, but there were no other mutilations.
The Stride murder is different from the other Ripper crimes in as much as he didn't mutilate the body. But there are a number of reasons for this. One, the most popular explanation, is at the arrival of a man called Louis Diemschutz, who'd been away at a market that day, and he arrived back with his horse and cart and discovered that he was the man who actually discovered the body. It's thought that his arrival, that the Ripper was probably hiding in the shadows somewhere and then made his escape whilst there was all the confusion going along following the discovery of the body.
The killer fled west a few blocks, encountering another woman outside a nearby church.
But of course, in 1888, all the traffic was horse-drawn and moved at a much slower pace than it does today. So this made the street in front of this church a good place for the prostitutes to pick up customers. The only problem was that if the prostitute stood still and didn't keep walking about, then she could be arrested by the police for soliciting. So what the prostitutes did, and this is why I referred to this church as the prostitutes' church, they used this church like a traffic roundabout. If you can imagine long lines of prostitutes going round and round and round the church. On the other side of the street, not far from this church, Catherine Eddowes was picked up by Jack the Ripper. Eddowes was seen at 1:35 a.m. talking to her killer with her hand on his chest.
Within 10 minutes of last being seen, Catherine Eddowes was dead. At 1:45 a.m., a police constable found her mutilated body in Mitre Square, only a few hundred yards from the church.
The face had been slashed down both cheeks. There may have been an attempt to cut off one of her ears. One of the cuts had gone through the tip of her nose, which dropped off into the clothing when the body was picked up. The throat had been cut back to the spine. The clothes had been pushed up, forced up, the insides lifted out and dropped over her right shoulder. And nobody had seen or heard a thing. Not the policeman on the beat, the policeman and his family there, the night porter there, or the witnesses out there. Now remember, this is the second killing in 40 minutes.
The pair of killings would become known as the double event.
The double killing is believed to have occurred because he was so psyched up after the first killing, he hadn't time to complete what he'd wanted to do.
Police were certain the Ripper had committed both crimes because of their proximity and an eyewitness, Israel Schwartz.
He saw them fight, and he saw the guy hit Liz Stride, and she fell to the floor with a scream. And then 15, 20 minutes later, she's found dead. From my point of view, and from most people's point of view, that's important because if you think it's possible that Liz Stride was attacked by two people that night within 15 minutes of each other, the chances of that may be a little remote.
In addition to an eyewitness, the police found something more.
The Ripper this time left what is probably the only clue he ever really did leave. A couple of blocks to the east of Mitre Square, he threw a piece of blood-stained apron into the doorway of numbers 108 to 119 Galston Street. This was Edo's apron, so it was definitely thrown down by the killer. Above this piece of apron, on the jamb of the door, was written a message in chalk: "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Now, many argue that this was written by the killer.
And there was, again, an upsurge of anti-Semitic feeling. And to such an extent that the chief rabbi in London at the time had said to all Jewish people, this is a time that we must play a low profile. We don't really want anything brought to attention for people to seize on Jews being the cause for this.
The anti-Semitic climate in the community led Commissioner Warren to make a questionable investigative decision.
Detectives were stationed by this doorway so that a photograph could be taken of the message once it was daylight. But now the incredible happens. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner, ex-Army man Sir Charles Warren, orders the message to be rubbed from the wall without any photographs being taken of it. When the detectives protest and ask why, well, says Warren, there are lots of Jews living in this area. This could be an incitement to race riots.
Well, I think the erasing is a move of mammoth stupidity, considering that they did have cameras at the time and they could have, they could have photographed it if it was relevant. And I suppose out of its erasing has arrived the great conspiracy theories. I think I rather agree with some other commentators of the time or later that there was massive amounts of graffiti about, so it may mean absolutely nothing.
As for the piece of apron, the only real benefit that has to us, the only real clue that it provided, is that it shows the direction that the Ripper left when he left from Mitre Square. It shows that Jack the Ripper was heading back into the East End of London. He wasn't heading into the wealthier city. And that's really the only clue that the apron provides us. It shows us the way that the Ripper was moving and the probability of where he was living, or at least where he was trying to make his escape to.
Police surgeon Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown performed the autopsy on Catherine Eddowes.
The peritoneal lining was cut through on the left side, and the left kidney carefully taken out and removed. To have removed the kidney and to know where it was placed, such a knowledge might be possessed by someone in the habit of cutting up animals.
Brown's report revived theories that the Ripper was a doctor, a tradesman skilled with a knife, or a madman experienced in anatomy. Missing from Eddowes' body was not only her kidney, but, like Chapman, her womb. In the wake of these four horrific murders, all of London shuddered, wondering not if, but when the killer would strike again. By October 1888, the police had launched an all-out search for Whitechapel's elusive serial killer. Following the double event, police patrols in the area increased dramatically with undercover detectives, some disguised as women working the docks. Police also posted warnings for women to stay off the streets. But for the East End's prostitutes, this was hardly an option.
For the women who kept going out on the streets, for those casual prostitutes, life was already a gamble. They were living on the margins economically. That gamble just got harder and the stakes just got much more drastic.
They were on the streets all night long, right through the murders. Desperation, lack of money, they had to be on the streets trying to earn a living, and some of them were so hopeless that they said, well, that, you know, they'd rather fall victim to Jack the Ripper than to have to jump off a bridge and commit suicide.
The murders are concentrated in a very, very tiny area, and there was an absolute terror in the Whitechapel and the surrounding districts. You have this enormous petition put up from the women of Whitechapel, 40,000 women petitioning Queen Victoria, you know, sort of to get something done about the murders.
The Queen responded to the petition by contacting the police authorities and writing a letter to the Prime Minister.
This new, most ghastly murder shows the absolute necessity for some very decided action. All these courts must be lit and our detectives improve. They are not what they should be.
So, as we went through this, it became very, very serious very early on. As probably you know, to a certain extent, that questions were being asked in Parliament, and Queen Victoria got involved, the monarch at the time. It was asking questions, and government nearly fell on this.
In a last-ditch effort to counter mounting criticism, the police consented to using bloodhounds in the investigation. Commissioner Warren volunteered to play the fugitive during a test manhunt in Hyde Park. Unfortunately, the dogs were unable to follow his scent, and the failure heightened the public's ridicule. Then, on October the 16th, the gruesome case took a ghoulish turn. George Lusk of Whitechapel's Mile End Vigilance Committee received a small parcel in the mail. Inside it, a piece of human kidney and a letter addressed, "From Hell."
Mr. Lusk, sir, I send you off the kidney I took from one, preserved it for you. T'other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out, if you only wait a while longer. Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk.
There was no certainty the kidney came from Catherine Eddowes' body. The newspapers reported that a doctor of pathology at London Hospital confirmed it came from a 45-year-old woman who suffered from Bright's disease, a condition brought on by alcoholism.
The pathologist's description of the remaining kidney in Eddowes' body was that it was pale, bloodless and congested at the pyramids, which in fact was a sign of Bright's disease, but that's the only indication that it may have existed. And Bright's disease was quite common, so I don't think too much can be read into that at all.
There's a lot of argument about it, but the general consensus seems to be that yes, the piece of kidney was genuine. She suffered from Bright's disease. This piece of kidney matched up with the fragment inside Catherine Eddowes. So if you accept the kidney is genuine, you have to accept the letter is genuine. And if you accept the letter is genuine, then the letter is unsigned. There is no name of Jack the Ripper. So possibly, presumably, the murderer was rejecting that identity that was being put on him by the papers.
Experts then and now have debated which of the letters, if any, is authentic, but they do agree on one thing. Searching for a killer who targets random strangers is a daunting investigative challenge, even today.
We're very fortunate. This is why the police officers in those days had a far harder job than police officers today. We have got professionals to help us. We can go, to the FBI or have our own people do offender profiling and come up with a profile of what the guy will look like and how he will act, etc., etc.
During the late 1880s, in the wake of Darwin's theory of evolution, criminology linked human behavior to biological factors. Distinctive physical traits and facial features were believed to reveal criminal types who were seen as more ape-like creatures, not as fully developed as most humans. Research into this area probably did little more than reinforce prevailing ethnic stereotypes and prejudices, and it likely had the police and the public looking for the wrong man. In fact, what might have served the Ripper best was a deceptively ordinary appearance, one that would not draw attention during a time of great fear and suspicion. Today, behavioral scientists called profilers go beyond physical characteristics to unravel the twisted motives of the killers they pursue.
Profiling is the study of an unsolved crime of violence with the goal of arriving at characteristics and traits of the unidentified offender. Age, race, marital status, arrest history, educational history, that type of thing. The purpose of a profile is not to identify a particular person, but rather to identify a personality type.
A century after the murders, the FBI's Behavioral Sciences Unit constructed a psychological profile of Jack the Ripper from evidence available at the time.
We had available to us the autopsy reports, photographs, crime scene sketches, a map of the area in which the crimes had occurred with the location of each of those crimes. We also had, most importantly, the victimology. The people who were in fact the victims of Jack the Ripper, we had their history. They were all prostitutes. They were all derelicts, alcoholics. They all lived in the same vicinity. They were all mutilated in a very, very similar manner.
If you accept this guy had a pathological hatred of women, maybe that is what he would take. That is what he would see as, you know, the thing that a woman's got and a man hasn't. So maybe he if he hates women that much, the uterus and the womb is the thing he will cut out, because that defines a woman.
By mutilating the victim, he in a sense neuters her, he desexes her, and she's no longer something to fear. And he also has that opportunity to carry out all of his anger, which is primarily directed toward women. Jack the Ripper is motivated by anger and a sense of fear toward women.
As vicious as his killings were, there's no evidence that the Ripper raped his victims.
In order to be a sexual crime, one does not have to commit rape or any type of recognizable sexual assault. Jack the Ripper's crimes were sexually motivated. When we profiled Jack the Ripper, we profiled him as being an individual who is a white male, late 20s to mid 30s, an individual who was an inadequate person, an individual who is a loner, preferred his own company to the company of others.
The FBI categorized the Ripper as a disorganized killer, one whose methods are erratic and impulsive.
We thought that because of the locations where he committed 4 of the 5 crimes. They were outdoors, they were on the streets or in a courtyard, a very high-risk crime. In other words, whoever this person was almost oblivious to the risk. All the bodies were quickly discovered. So there's not a great deal of planning that went into those crimes. All of those things told us that we were not dealing with a rocket scientist in this case. We said that he lived right in that location. He was very, very comfortable with those crime scene locations. Very, very comfortable because, as I recall, in one case, a police officer walked by and saw the victim, came back 20 minutes later, and the victim was found dead at that same location.
Others believe the Ripper fits the description of the organized offender, citing his ability to engage his victims, the consistency of his methods, and the fact that he left few clues.
Jack the Ripper is a sexual deviant whose attacks become, to my mind, increasingly frenzied. He runs risks, but nobody actually sees him committing any of the crimes, despite the fact there are considerable numbers of people about on the night in question.
In the end, however, profilers admit that theirs is an inexact science at best.
Profiling is nothing more than an opinion of the individual preparing the profile. It's not a science, it's an art.
November 9th, 1888. Over a month after the double event, an uneasy calm had settled on the Whitechapel district. Mary Jane Kelly, a young woman in her 20s, is seen by a witness leaving a pub with a man sometime around 3 a.m. She invites her companion inside her lodging house at 13 Miller's Court. Just before 4 a.m., 3 women living in the room above Kelly reported hearing a cry of murder. But it was hours before her fate was known. She was the 5th victim killed in 10 weeks, all of them murdered within a mile of each other.
Mary Kelly was behind with a rent, and a landlord sent someone round to sort of ask her for the rent. And when the messenger didn't get any answer by knocking on the door, he went round to the side of the room where there was a broken window, pushed out the rags and newspaper, putting his hand through the glass, he pulled back the curtain, and then he saw the body of Mary Kelly.
It was a total evisceration of the body. He'd severed the head from the body. He then skinned the face. He'd opened it from the throat to the groin, from the knee to the groin was opened up.
A horrific sight, even for veteran detectives Abberline and Swanson. This was the Ripper's most vicious attack yet.
In victim number 5, for the very first time, he had a private environment. The victim took him to her flat, and at that point in time, he was not going to be disturbed. So he could engage in every type of deviant, lustful desire that he had without the possibility of being disturbed and without any time constraints.
From those sort of killings, once you've done one kind of rip and done one thing, then it gets no thrill for you. You've done it. So each rip gets worse than the one before to get the thrill and the sexual thrill out of it.
Political pressures and the strain of the Ripper murders weighed heavily on Commissioner Warren. The day before Mary Kelly's killing, he resigned his position. Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson remained on as supervisor with Detectives Swanson and Abberline investigating, but police efforts seemed hopelessly thwarted. In a desperate attempt to find Mary Kelly's killer, government authorities offered a pardon to anyone supplying information leading to the apprehension and conviction of the murderer.
Now that indicates that they thought that more than one person was involved, or that somebody had information about it. It's a very odd move to make, to go to the Home Office and for the Home Secretary to issue a pardon in advance to a co-conspirator.
The pardon offer went unanswered, and for weeks nothing happened. Then, the murders stopped. Just 3 months after Mary Kelly's death, the police reduced their patrols in Whitechapel.
The interesting thing for me is the murders stop, but in less time than the time between 2 of the murders in the middle of a series, the whole inquiry has stood down. So I think the cops obviously knew something that we don't know.
It was police policy not to release information about unsolved crimes or the progress of ongoing investigations. But as a result, it opened the door to many theories, some wildly far-fetched, about the identity of the Ripper.
These theories started in 1888 and they've been going ever since. He's been an abortionist, he's been a female abortionist, Jill the Ripper.
One of the more bizarre ones quite recently, and I find this really bizarre, is that of Lewis Carroll. The author of Alice in Wonderland has now been named as Jack the Ripper. And then, of course, in recent years, you've had a whole range of theories built around the British royal family in the person of Queen Victoria's grandson, the Duke of Clarence, who dies within 4 years of the Ripper murders.
The royal theory is in fact a theory involving the Freemasons, in that the Duke of Clarence, or as he was then the Prince Eddie, the son of the Prince of Wales, and heir presumptive to the throne, was involved in a liaison with a Catholic girl, which would obviously not be the thing for a member of the royal family to do.
According to this theory, the Ripper's last victim, Mary Kelly, knew of the prince's illicit affair and was blackmailing him. This led Sir William Gull, the royal doctor, to kill Mary and the other prostitutes. A Freemason, Gull then supposedly left the mutilated remains of Kelly and the others as an ancient ritual punishment for betraying government secrets.
There was an account, a Masonic account, of the punishment by the biblical King Solomon of the 3 Jews who are said to have murdered his master mason who built his Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. And according to this Masonic account, these 3 Jews were punished by the biblical King Solomon by having their throats cut, their breasts burst open, and their bodies scattered. And in the Masonic references to those 3 Jews, the word Jews was spelled J-U-W-E-S, exactly as it was written in this doorway over here. So how Eddowes died and the spelling of the word Jews, that is what has led to the suggestion that the murderer was either a Freemason or knew something about Freemasonry.
My own personal view is that it was a lovely, sensational story, and it sells papers. And a lot of people may have probably thought there was something in it at the time.
Another theory held that Jack the Ripper was an American, a doctor named Francis Tumblety. A frequent visitor to London with dubious medical credentials, Tumblety had over the years faced a number of charges, including malpractice, sedition, and possibly a part in the Lincoln assassination. Just 2 days before Mary Kelly's murder, Tumblety was arrested for assault, then later released. His whereabouts were unknown until the end of November, when he departed for New York City.
He was actually followed to New York by Inspector Andrews, one of the investigators, from where Tumblety fled.
Police on both sides of the Atlantic waited for Tumblety to appear. Railway stations and departing steamers were closely watched. But he was never seen again, leading some to think he was the Ripper.
I think there are lots of reasons that make him a good suspect. I think it was given some credence when Wynne Baxter, the coroner, summed up at the inquest on Chapman and said that an American doctor had been trying to buy wombs from one of the London teaching hospitals. He also was allegedly the possessor of a collection of wombs in glass jars back in 1865 around Washington, when he was practicing in Washington. So it's a combination of things, really. He was arrested at the time of the murders. There is just nothing that can conclusively say he couldn't be the Ripper.
But skeptics point to several reasons why Tumblety probably isn't the Ripper. To begin with, he was older and considerably taller than the suspects described by witnesses. Plus, he wore a moustache with very long, waxed ends. He was also a known homosexual, placing him at odds with the behaviour of serial killers who usually victimise the gender that attracts them. Lastly, Tumblety would have been a stranger in the community.
Just patterns of speech alone would have given him away. So he would have been more suspect. He would have stood out. But again, for the women, the economic potential of such a man might have led them to see him differently and to engage in contact.
By 1894, 6 years after the murders, speculation about the Ripper's identity was still rampant. That year, Chief Constable Sir Melville Macnaghten wrote a memorandum refuting a newspaper article alleging that the Ripper was a man named Thomas Cutbush.
He claimed Thomas Cutbush had been interviewed by police officers and totally exonerated, and he couldn't possibly have done the murders. As he went on, he said not only was Cutbush nothing to do with this at all, he said, I can name 3 top suspects that the police officers at the time, 6 years previously, considered far more likely to have been Jack the Ripper.
He named Montague M.J. Druitt, who he called a doctor, but who in fact was a barrister and teacher. He named Kosminski, without a first name, just Kosminski, a Polish Jew. And he also named Michael Ostrog, who in fact was a con man and a convict, and who the police later had in custody, so it's virtually impossible that he was the Ripper.
According to Macnaghten, the most likely of the 3 suspects was Montague Druitt, who disappeared shortly after Mary Kelly's murder. But strangely, Macnaghten's memorandum was the only document ever to name Druitt.
We have absolutely no idea why he was ever suspected of being the Ripper. He committed suicide at the end of December 1888. He drowned himself in the Thames, apparently because of some misdemeanour at the boys' school that he was teaching at.
Macnaghten based much of his belief on secret documents that he allegedly destroyed prior to his retirement.
All we know is that Sir Melville Macnaghten says that at some point later after the crimes, that he received private information that suggested that Druitt was the murderer, and he was quite prepared to believe that.
Another of Macnaghten's suspects also seems highly unlikely.
His name was Michael Ostrog. Nothing was known about him until quite recently. We've now discovered quite a lot about him. He was a petty sneak thief. Again, there's no obvious reason why anybody would ever have suspected that he was Jack the Ripper.
The remaining suspect was a man named Kosminski, a Polish Jew who, according to McNaughton, possessed a great hatred of women, particularly prostitutes, and had strong homicidal tendencies. There were many reasons that made Kosminski a prime suspect, but one seemed particularly telling. Dr. Robert Anderson, Deputy Commissioner under Sir Charles Warren, published an autobiography some 20 years after the murders. He called it The Lighter Side of My Official Life. Detective Donald Swanson, who worked under Anderson, had read the book, scribbling notes along the margins. In 1987, a descendant of Swanson had those notes printed in the Daily Telegraph. What they revealed was startling, that Swanson and Anderson knew exactly who Jack the Ripper was.
Swanson, in some notes that he made in his own personal copy of Sir Robert Anderson's autobiography, identified that individual as somebody called Kosminski.
He wrote in the margin of that book, yes, we did know who Jack the Ripper was at the time, and he said it was Kosminski. And he actually said Kosminski.
The same Kosminski Chief Constable McNaughton had listed in his memorandum. He was a man not unknown to the police. Shortly after Liz Stride's murder, Israel Schwartz identified Kosminski in a police lineup. But there was a problem. Schwartz refused to testify against him.
Schwartz identified Kosminski as the man he'd seen that night. Now, this, of course, is the only evidence the police have got. There's no forensic, nothing else. It's got to be something like this. But Schwartz refused to give evidence at court. He claimed that he was Jewish, Kosminski was Jewish, and he would not have the death of another Jew on his conscience.
According to Swanson, the reason he refused to testify was because he knew that his testimony would send this person to the gallows.
Without that testimony, police had no grounds to hold Kosminski.
He was released into the custody of his brother, who lived in Whitechapel, who looked after him. And he was then, according to all the police records, he was watched continuously. And they followed him 24 hours a day through the East End of London. No more murders ever took place. And then sometime later he was taken from the home, taken to a mental institution and spent the rest of his time there.
A fairly thorough search of asylum records has shown that there's only one Kosminski who was committed to an asylum, and he was committed to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum, and his name was Aaron Kosminski.
There's only three ways this is going to end, isn't there? It's either the person goes abroad, they die, or they're incarcerated. But all aid was stood down to the East End of London at Christmas 1888. Now that tells you that the police officers then were pretty sure they knew who Jack the Ripper was. To actually cancel all the aid at that early, only a month, 6 weeks after the last murder, tells you they knew, they were convinced, absolutely convinced, that they knew who Jack the Ripper was.
Yet if the police did know the Ripper's identity, why they didn't publicise it becomes another mystery. Speculation has continued for over a century. But there are some who see only one likely suspect.
In 1888, they looked at Ostrog, they looked at Druitt, but they were convinced it was Kosminski. Now, people would come up with all different things, but as I said before, if it was good enough for the investigating officers at the time, it's probably good enough for me 110 years later. And there's no doubt, since then, as far as I'm concerned, from my point of view, from a policeman's point of view, all other suspects would go out of the window.
Our profile fit one of the suspects almost dead bang. That doesn't mean he did it. It simply means he fit the characteristics and traits that we believe would have been possessed by the individual known as Jack the Ripper. And that was an individual by the name of Kosminski. I believe he was psychotic. I believe that legal term, he was insane. I think Jack the Ripper's murder stopped because he got caught. And that's what I believe. He was either institutionalized, he was arrested, but he was certainly brought to the attention of the authorities, in my opinion.
There aren't any surviving pictures of what the detectives thought Jack the Ripper looked like. What there is Abeline's walking stick, which has a carved head and was presented to him by the detectives he worked with. Anybody knows that you can't carve from a description, you have to carve from a drawing. So somewhere they must have had a witness's drawing of what Jack the Ripper looked like.
Kosminski appears the strongest suspect, but with so many conflicting theories, there seems little doubt the identity of Jack the Ripper will continue to be debated.
We will never know who Jack the Ripper was for certain. That is patently obvious. In 1888, they didn't know, they had ideas, they didn't know for certain, they certainly couldn't prove it. If they couldn't prove it 111 years ago, we won't prove it today.
I don't think anybody will ever know for certain who Jack the Ripper was. And I have a feeling that even if evidence comes to light that gives us a very good indication of who he was, I think that there are people out there who, the majority of people, actually don't want the mystery to be solved at all.
The whole name of the game with Jack the Ripper is writing books about it, making money about it, taking people on walks and things like that. I honestly, personally, I don't personally believe, but I only personally believe if somebody could tomorrow absolutely conclusively prove who Jack the Ripper was, nobody would believe them at all.
So you can imagine him just standing there, sort of enjoying all this, probably enjoying all the sensation and being one of the crowd watching the effect that he'd achieved.
The unsolved mystery of the Whitechapel murders still haunts the streets of London's East End, as does the killer, whose savage crimes reveal the twisted, dark side of the human mind. And in some ways he remains with us. The memory of his vague figure, lurking in the shadows, reminds us of our deepest fears and exposes our most dreaded nightmares. Yet it does more, unmasking for us our macabre and all too human fascination with evil.